Hey friends, it is good to see you. It is Wednesday, July 15th. You know what today is? Today is tax day in 2020. Because everything in 2020 has just been thrown out the window. So today is tax day. And if you're watching this right now and you're thinking, oh no, I didn't get my taxes done. Well, you can finish watching this and then go finish your taxes. So anyways, it's good to be with you tonight. And so we're going to continue our messages about the idea of feeding your faith and not your fears, and how important that is that we as a people are worried more about filling ourselves up with the Lord. And I believe as we fill ourselves up more and we fill our cup up more, there will be more that we'll be able to handle, and we'll be able to sustain and to get through and have the hope in the Lord that is necessary to manage what is going on around us. So as we get going here, let me open us in prayer and we'll get started. God, I thank you for the opportunity to be able to come together and look at your word, the opportunity to look at what it means to not be people that are feeding our fears, but in fact, we're feeding our faith. And so, God, I pray that you would help us now in this time as we look into your word to be with us and to guide us and give us your message. In Jesus' name, amen. So as we get started, for today, we're going to this little thing tonight is called Do Not Be Bitter, but Trust in True Authority. So that's what we're going to be looking at. It's going to be out of Numbers 20, 1 to 13. And we'll be looking at the passage about how Moses and Aaron were with the people. The people were upset that they didn't have any water, they didn't have any grain, they didn't have any grapes, they didn't have pomegranates, you name it. They didn't have food to eat in the middle of the desert. And that's when God instructed Moses to speak to the rock. And of course, they did get water through that time. So we're going to be taking a look at that and what that means. But as we get started here, let me just remind you of Psalm 25, 1 to 2, because this is the verse that we started with last week. And let me just reference this again to say, those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. And again, this passage is a beautiful passage as it does share the idea about those who trust in the Lord are going to be like Mount Zion. They will not be shaken. They'll be like a solid rock. And so we need to remember that as a people, that the more we can set our feet on solid rock, we will not be shaken, just as if it's the house that's built in the rock and not on the sand. So that is key for us. And as we talked about this, we talked about the idea of a thermostat and a thermometer. And of course, the simple idea is if you are more like a thermometer, you're allowing everything around you to affect you. Whether things heat up or they cool down, you are going with what is happening in the world around you, or what somebody might say to you, how it might affect you. But the thermostat, of course, allows us to control our climate, doesn't it? It allows us to turn up the heat when we need or cool things. The point is, it allows us to control and allows us to set things instead of allowing the temperature outside of us control us. We're able to control that temperature that we need it to be. And of course, we want the Lord to be our thermostat in our lives to control things for us. So as we get going here in this do not bitter, but trust the true authority, we're going to take a look at Numbers 20. 1 to 13. It's a little long, but we're going to read it. I do think it's important that we take a good look at this passage. So if you have a Bible, or if you can just want to read it on the screen, you can. But it's Numbers 20, 1 to 13. This is what it says. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Sin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community. And the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. And Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. And you will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, and I would say even more like he yelled at him, so keep that in mind. He says, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and the livestock, they all were able to drink. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." There were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled, and the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. So this really is a fascinating story, isn't it? I mean, it truly is a fascinating segment of the time of when the Israelites were wandering in the desert. We know that they were unhappy at this point. We know that they wanted their water. They wanted fruit. They wanted grains. They wanted their pomegranates. But we need to recognize something as we continue into the heart of this passage. There's something that is it needs to be pointed out, and that is where they were. And I think the writer purposely puts this in there to tell everybody that they are now back in the same place. They're back at the desert of Zin in Kadesh. And I would say they're not only there, but they've returned back to that location. And of course, just remember this. They wanted water. They wanted fruit. They wanted grains. They wanted all these wonderful things that they could eat and drink and take care of their livestock. Well, let me remind you, let's take a think about this. I want you to think about why the desert of Zin is so important, because it goes back to Numbers 13. And if we were to go back to Numbers 13, you might recall that the Lord told Moses to send out spies to see what is in the promised land. We know how that went. Of course, we know that the majority said, we can't do this. Yes, there's land flowing with milk and honey. Yes, there's all these wonderful things there. But did you see the size of those people? Did you see what's going on there? There's no way we would be able to take them on. And so, it's interesting that where they are now was the same place. It's as if they've been wandering around in circles, and now they're back at the same place in which they were challenged to go take a good look so they can see how good it would be to trust in the Lord to get all the good things that the Lord wants to provide for them. They had the opportunity. They had the opportunity to go. So now that they've wandered more, where are they? They're back at the same place. And not just back at the same place physically, but they're back at the same place emotionally and spiritually. Think about it. What are they doing? They're back again grumbling. They're back again mad. They're upset. They are ticked off because they had left Egypt where all these wonderful things were. And this is key. I want you to understand something, because this comes back to obedience. This comes back to obedience and what happened here in this time, in this moment. They were grumbling for water, grapes, and grain. And Scripture here tells us that there was no water for them in the community. There was no relief in sight for their wandering in the desert. And the Israelites were not happy with their given situation. They were not happy with what's happening around them. In fact, they were pretty ticked off, especially when it says that they were up against Moses and Aaron. They didn't just were like telling them they were upset. It says that they opposed them on this so much that they gathered and they quarreled with Moses and Aaron. And how bad was their situation? It was so bad that we read in the Scripture, again, of course, they would rather die. They would have rather died than being worried that they're stuck in the wilderness and are not trusting the Lord in this time. So not unusual, Moses and Aaron went to the tent. They went to the tent of meeting and fell down before the Lord. And the Lord, of course, gives them that specific direction on what to do. He says, take the staff and go and speak to the rock, and it will pour out its water. But Moses now at this point seems to have been worn down and tired and just feeling like this is ridiculous, right? And he's pretty annoyed with the people. And I would even say he's pretty bitter. He's pretty bitter at this point. Because what happens? He does not do what the Lord tells him to do. He instead, with a bitter and I would say an angry heart, tells the Israelites, what's he yell at? He yells at them. He goes, you rebels. I mean, think about that phrase, you rebels, right? All I can think of is Star Wars when he says, you rebel scum, right? He's basically calling them out and saying, I can't believe you are being so rebellious and all these things. And he goes on, he says, must I really bring this water out of the rock for you? Must I do it? And just like, and when I think about what he did, and this reminds me of, out of his anger, and it looks like what my son Jake does when he mishits a golf ball on the golf course with his club. When he gets angry and he like smacks the club down like twice, bam, bam, right? Moses will have anger, didn't speak to the rock like the Lord told him to. What does he do? He takes the staff and it says he struck the rock twice, bam, bam, and water came pouring out. And what's interesting about it, and again, of course, the Lord does what? He provides, even in the midst of their bitterness and their anger and all they are. It says it was enough water, more than enough water, to feed the community and the livestock. And that was not a small group of people. That must have been a lot of water pouring out of that rock. But the Lord provided it, again, for the people. But we see a lot of bitterness, don't we? We see a lot of bitterness. We see a lot of anger. We see a lot of resentment. We see a lot of fear. We see a lot of disobedience. And we see a serious lack of trust in the Lord. And when I think about this, even though the people, and this is so important, even though the people were grumblers, and even though they were cranky, and they had a serious lack of trust in all these things, and even though Moses did not do what the Lord had asked him to do, and to just speak to the rock, and it was supposed to be on Moses to say, the Lord has given us this day the water that will come from this rock. I command this rock in the name of the Lord to pour out water. But Moses comes along and says, must I do this for you? As if it was his job to do it, or it was 50-50 with the Lord. That's not what the Lord wanted. The Lord wanted the glory to go to him. But in the midst of all that, even the Israelites were being disobedient and Moses was being disobedient. What happened? God still provided. God still provided the water they needed, regardless of their actions. And let me just give a quick side note here. Let us remember that Jesus himself says what? He's the living water. And we know that he is our rock. And the Lord gave us Christ, even though we did not deserve to be saved. Now, I'm not going to go there. That's a totally different sermon for another time. But it is important to remember about who Christ is in our life. And that the water, the living water that we can have, the trust we can have in him. So in this message, though, I can only imagine that as the Israelites were fed and had water, life was fine. So like when they were in different parts of the desert and they found water or they found food, life seemed to be just fine. But then there were times when life just seemed to be awful, seemed to be unpredictable, seemed to be like, what are we doing here? This is the worst place we could be. And so when they found themselves at the places where they had enough water, they had enough food, they were comfortable. But when they were pressed, their true colors definitely shone through. And it's interesting, just as the Israelites were wandering, right? Think about this. Just as the Israelites were wandering, are we not wondering personally when this time will end? What seems like we're in a weird place. We're in a weird desert time. This 2020 seems like a weird time for us. When will this end for us? And yes, we could be full of bitterness and full of anger and full of resentment. But I ask that question because I think about us and I think about how about you? How has this pandemic affected your life? How has it affected how you think about things? How have you responded? And unfortunately, how has this pandemic caused you to feed your fears? You know, I've talked to a lot of people as we've gone through this time. And one thing for sure that I see often, or see a lot of, is like, I do see bitterness. I see people just so bitter that this is happening, so ticked off that they can't go and eat in their favorite restaurant, or they can't go and do this, or they can't go and just do some normal things. And they're bitter. And it's hard. And I guess I ask that question, are you bitter that your life has been changed? But then I also ask the question, how has this been a time in which your level of trust in the Lord hopefully has risen, has not fallen? Let me say this. I do believe this is true. A deeper faith and a constant faith has most likely weathered this pandemic. I believe that. A deeper faith and a consistent faith has most likely weathered this pandemic. And I'm not trying to say that, somebody's better than somebody else. But I'm just going to say how important it is to fill ourselves and to deepen our walk with the Lord. One thing is for sure, I do think that this time has caused all of us to have a deeper prayer life. In his book, Along Obedience in the Same Direction, Eugene Peterson talks about how we don't put ourselves deliberately in the places that evoke heartfelt prayer. He comments on how, think about this, he comments on this, what most Christians do is come to church, a place that is safe and moderately predictable. This time has certainly, I think, stoked up the fires of fear. We have concerns and we are anxious at times. And there's more to this story. There's a story, it's what we call like a hospital story. And it comes from his book as well. And I'm going to read a segment of that book to you right now. But let me say this though first. He tells a story of having to have surgery on his nose and needing to share a hospital room with a 22-year-old. This must have been an older story, and you'll understand why, because of the boy came in, or the 22-year-old came in to have his tonsils removed, but they had him come in the night before. And he had his nose surgery done, and he had to stay overnight. And those kind of things today, you come in and you go home, right? And so let me take you a minute, and let's just read this from the book. And it's a little long, but I want to finish with this little segment because I think it's important to hear this. So he writes this. He says, an incident took place a few years ago that has acquired the force of a parable for me. I had a minor operation on my nose and was in a hospital room recovering. Even though the surgery was minor, the pain was great and I was full of misery. Late in the afternoon, a man was assigned to the other bed in the room. He was to have a tonsillectomy the next day. He was young. He was about 22 years old. He was good looking and friendly. He came over to me, put out his hand and said, "Hi, my name is Kelly. What happened to you?" I was in no mood for friendly conversations, did not return the handshake, grunted my name, and said that I had gotten my nose broken. He got the message that I did not want to talk. He pulled the curtain between our beds and let me alone. Later in the evening, his friends were visiting, and I heard him say, "Hey, there's a man in the next bed who is a prize fighter. He got his nose broken in a championship fight." He went on to embellish the story for the benefit of his friends. Later in the evening, as I was feeling better, I said, "Kelly, you misunderstood what I said. I'm not a prize fighter. The nose was broken years ago in a basketball game, and I'm just now getting it fixed." "Well, what do you do then?" "I'm a pastor." "Oh," he said, and he turned away, and I was no longer an interesting subject. In the morning, he woke me. Peterson, wake up." I groggily came awake and asked what he wanted. "I want you to pray for me. I'm scared." And so before he was taken to surgery, I went to his bedside and prayed for him. When he was brought back a couple hours later, a nurse came and said, "Kelly, I'm going to give you an injection that should take care of the pain that you might be having." In 20 minutes or so, he began to groan. "I hurt. I can't stand it. I'm going to die." I rang for the nurse, and when she came, said, "Nurse, I don't think that shot did any good. Why don't you give him another one?" She didn't acknowledge my credentials for making such a suggestion as a pastor, but she told me curtly that she would oversee the medical care of the patient. Turned on her heel, and a little abruptly, I thought, left. And meanwhile, Kelly continued to vent his agony. After another half an hour, he began to hallucinate, and having lost touch with reality, began to shout, "Peterson, pray for me. Can't you see I'm dying? Peterson, pray for me." His shouts brought nurses and doctors and all kinds of people running. They held him down and quieted him with another injection that I had prescribed earlier. And here's the story, folks. This is what he says then. This is powerful. The parabolic force of the incident is this. When the man was scared, he wanted me to pray for him. And when the man was crazy, he wanted me to pray for him. But the in-between, during the hours of so-called normalcy, he didn't want anything to do with a pastor. What Kelly betrayed in extremes is all what many people know of religion. A religion to help them with their fears, but that it is forgotten when the fears are taken care of. A religion made of moments of craziness, but that is a remote shadowy in the clear light of the sun and the routines of every day. The most religious places in the world, as a matter of fact, are not churches, but battlefields and mental hospitals. You are much more likely to find passionate prayer in a foxhole than in a church pew. Just think about that. And I think about that, and I think about the difficulties we're going through. And I do believe that this time has obviously, I think, taken away our normalcy and has brought us to a deeper sense and need for the Lord. And I pray that's true for you. I pray that you would not have this bitter resentment of what you think is like awful and everything that's going on, but that it actually has attracted you and guided you back to the Lord to feed your faith more instead of feeding your fears. When I think about this story, and I want to just finish with this real quick. The people of Israel obviously had lost their trust when things got awful. And Moses let his anger and his bitterness get the best of him when he was challenged. So much so that he was not making very good decisions, was he? I mean, it sounds like he totally went against what God wished and wanted him to do. All this came down to trust and to remember who the real authority was. Wasn't Moses the one that was standing up there saying, "I'll do this for you"? But the real authority was the Lord. That's my prayer. My prayer is that we would remember who we can trust. My prayer is that we would remember that it is the Lord that gives us his authority and will take care of us and watch over us in this time. And when I think about these, feed your faith and not your fears. When I think about, again, this illustration, how important it is that we remember that we want the Lord to have control over our temperature, of how we rise and fall. We don't want any other outside forces to do that. So I would encourage you and I would challenge you to be people that are wanting and willing to trust in the Lord in times that are really tough and at times that are really good. It doesn't matter what it is. So folks, with that, we're going to end our time here now, and we're going to jump into Zoom as we go into our time for our congregational prayer and connecting and gathering. Thanks again for watching in, and take care.